everyone. Today is Contemporary Personality Theory Day. We're going to be doing that first and then doing a review of defense mechanisms of Freud. Those are always kind of tough to try to take a scenario. So we're going to have another set of scenarios. And then you guys will do a discussion board on Freud based on your argument that you've created for that. So let's get into the more contemporary theories about personality. They're not psychodynamic. So the first one that was talked about refers back to one of those perspectives of psychology, the humanistic perspective. It's also known as the third force. I'll discuss what the third force is. And a lot of times in the AP exam, they will refer to the third force. So make sure that you have that somewhere really highlighted because they will mention that. So humanistic perspective really takes out the fact that there are unconscious or environmental things per se that are a part of why we become who we are. So the humanistic perspective again is emphasizing that unique potential we have as human beings, that idea of self-awareness, the fact that we do have free will, which was very different from what Freud said about determinism and about the fact that because we're being driven by unconscious things that we don't actually have free will. He did believe that humans were innately good, which is interesting when we kind of talk about like the Holocaust and kind of look at the reasons for the Holocaust when you look between Freud and Bandura. Focusing on the healthy personality versus people that are troubled and going through conflict. He said that people were motivated by the need to grow, and that it's not just because of environmental and reinforcers and punishments. That this humanistic perspective comes from, and that it's really, very subjective perception of him or herself. Most important people in this is Carl Rogers and Maslow. When we get into Bandura, we'll be talking about things a little bit differently than that, but those are the two important for that. So again, when we talk about the third force, let's look at the first and the second. The first force really is talking about the determinism. Second force is also determinism. It's just from a different perspective. But Freudian determinism believed that behavior is really determined by the unconscious. The second force is your environment. Your environment guides you through and reinforcers and punishments, and that's why it's determinism. So the first and the second force do not have free will. It's the third force that emphasizes the human freedom and potential. That's the one that people are trying to reach self-actualization. So existentialism is a sort of a part of that, and humanism in terms of potential. And that is that person has that guiding, ability to become who they want to become. That it's not being determined for them. So that's the idea of the third force. So make sure that you note that again in your notebook. Okay, when we talk about humanistic, let's start with Carl Rogers' theory. And he has a couple of important terms. He developed his theory kind of like Freud did, where he was working with clients and so forth. And so that's sort of why some of his, legitimacy of his theory is kind of, questioned. But he had them play an active role in their own therapy, which is kind of interesting, and that idea of that. Actualizing tendency is the drive that we all have to maintain and also enhance what we have. It's a biological and social driven things are secondary, and it's just this innate, thing that we're born with, that we want to become better. So an example of that is a little voice within us saying we need to try harder and to not give up, and we are sort of born with that part of us. And that sort of then will determine sort of what our personality will be. Self-concept is really important. It's an extremely important vocab word for psychology in general, and it's the cornerstone of this theory in particular. It's a set of perceptions and beliefs that we have about ourselves, including our nature, our personality qualities, and our typical behavior. And we act according to our self-concept. In fact, we will, ignore things and deny things if they are contradictory because we're trying to maintain that self-concept of ourselves. So when things happen that are outside of that, we will sort of deny or distort that and use what Freud would say is defense mechanisms. For instance, in childhood, where really egocentrism comes out, and that's why we have this more self-enhancing experiences. that we sort of focus on. And then later in life, with that self-awareness, we increase our positive regard. We love being loved, and we value that, and we will love and others as well. So we sort of change that, and that could be developmental as well. But self-concept is a huge part of Carl Rogers. Now, there's a couple things that will influence our self-concept, and a lot of that has to do, and it comes back to the idea of attachment and parenting, and that idea of relationships with other people, as we get into this positive regard and we're sort of loved and so forth. So when we have conditional love, not unconditional as we might think, but conditional. My love is conditioned on X, Y, Z, not unconditional, like you can do anything and then I'll love you. So the conditioned positive regard occurs when people only show love or affection when there's certain conditions or requirements that are met or satisfied. So this in a child can cause a child to learn to deny or distort their genuine feelings because they want to meet those expectations. So like Freud, Rogers believed feelings and experiences were driven from consciousness by being denied or distorted. So he did somewhat agree with that we use defense mechanisms if it threatens our self-concept, and that we sort of drive that away from our consciousness to sort of think about that. So then we enter this state of incongruency, or incongruency, yeah. So our self-concept is a conflict between the actual experiences. We sort of become out of touch with our true feelings because we're just trying to maintain and meet these expectations that are there for the person that's loving us. So an example of that would be a boy who believes that his parents would only show love and approval when he's successful at school will probably only talk about the things that he was successful at, not the fact that he got a C or a D on a test, but only the things that he did really well off, even if it's something like a sport versus an academic. The boy understands when he does not perform well at school, his parents are not going to show him affection. And so this results in this incongruent state where the boy knows he's not doing well in school, but he lies to his parents to gain their approval. So again, that's going to be out of characteristic of his self-concept, and he's trying to deny and so forth because he's not getting that approval that he needs, and it's not within his self-concept. So the self-concept is really not fulfilled because it's this constant denial of what he actually is compared to what his parents want him to be. The unconditional positive regard is one that we want. Occurs when a person expresses their love and affection without any conditions. So the actualizing tendency that, drive to be your best is at fullest potential. So again, it comes around with that type of parenting, that authoritative, not authoritarian or permissive, but we want that authoritative parenting that allows for mistakes, gets structure though. So not permissive parenting, we need authoritative because the parent needs to teach expectations as well as give love and support. So the parents, without undermining their self-worth, through their parenting and not rejecting the child completely, we want that child to be under with some structure and also with love and support. This is going to develop a fully functioning person with a very flexible, evolving self-concept because they're open to new experiences and know that that's okay for them to have those experiences. So they experience congruency, which is a sense of self-consistent with emotions and experiences, unlike incongruency where you're feeling one way and your experiences are another. This is like they're matching, and it makes choices that move them through that full potential growth. So again, this idea of personality is being generated through Carl Rogers through the humanistic perspective, and the fact that there's some things here that he's talking about how we develop this consistent pattern and this idea of self-concept. And then the actualizing tendency is the idea that we're the actions and the way that we feel is because we're trying to reach our highest potential. So then between conditional and unconditional positive regard, then he's talking about some of the things that can create personality traits because we're not being able to reach our fullest potential, if that makes sense. Okay, so the evaluation of this humanistic theory for Carl Rogers and for Maslow, and for that matter, is the validity and ability to test scientifically. It's really based on assumptions and observations, which is part of why Freud was sort of denounced as well. And it's difficult to measure somebody's self-concept and actualizing tendency. It's really not scientific. The data is just hard to measure, and it's really too optimistic, that we would achieve this self-actualization. And then it doesn't really describe a lot about destructive behaviors. Just, it may be a little bit of the distortion, but not some of the other behaviors that would need to be described with other personality theories. It does have influences, though. This perspective, like anything else, Freud has place in psychology, and so does humanistic. A lot of education. We talked a lot in education early on about self-concept, parenting and counseling. You can see that. Health, personality, and creativity, and subjective experiences and self-concept have definitely really been widely accepted about how we do have the self-concept. And I know it's taught in other places like health class and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about the social cognitive, which is Bandura. And we had Bandura before. Remember, he was the Bobo doll, observational learning, and so forth. And like I said, the personality and learning sort of cross over sometimes. So this theory is a person's conscious thought, not their unconscious, unlike Freud, their mental drives, but processes. They have their conscious thought processes in different situations, and that is going to strongly influence their actions, which then comes out as their personality. They process information from the social experiences, and that's going to influence their goals, their beliefs, their behaviors, and so forth. As you look at the chart to the right, influences would be, performance, vicarious learning. I'll go through that in a second. Social persuasion and emotional arousal, and then the possible outcomes is whether or not we persistent and performance, and then whether we approach versus avoid certain things, and that's going to be based on those environmental things. The sense of self is going to definitely vary per situation, and we know that. I think we all talk about, like, there's times where you act a certain way versus another way, and I think that's where Bandura would kind of say, I get this question all the time, like, how's my kid doing in school? And I'm like, oh, they're so polite. They work all the time. And I've had numerous parents tell me, like, who are you talking about? Unlike other parents where they're like, oh yeah, that's my kid. There's been a lot of parents in my career that have the personality at school doesn't match the personality at home, which is interesting. And that can be why, and so this would be a good example of how that would be explained. So active cognitive processes are looked at with this social cognitive perspective, and self-regulation. The self-generated goals affect thoughts, feelings, and actions, as Carl Rogers also said, but this cognitive processing and self-regulation through these social situations is really going to affect that. Humans observe behaviors and consequences to imitate. So again, that idea of observational learning and imitation is important. And he did rely on experimental findings for. So with social cognitive perspective, we have the idea of reciprocal determinism, and that's the idea that all of the behavior and personality is caused by an interaction between your behavior, your cognition, and your social influences or environmental influences. So for instance, if a person is playing chess, that their behavior is playing chess. The social part is the friends that they play chess with. And the cognition is, I think playing chess is cool and I need friends who want to play chess. So all of those three, sorry, I think it paused. So interacting with each other. And so when we looked at this, each factor influences the other. So our environment affects the thoughts and behaviors that we have. Our thoughts and influences and actions and environments that we choose. And then our actions influence our thoughts and environments that we do choose. So environment and cognition are both a cause and a consequence of the behavior, as you can see from the playing of the chess. In terms of social, friends who play chess. I have friends who play chess, and then therefore I think playing chess is cool, and then I play chess, and that's the idea of that behavior being guided by all those different things, and so forth. We can think of examples in our own life of when that would happen. And then, through those actions and whatnot, and the environments that we have a personality. We have people, saying these are sort of personality traits that are in common behaviors and patterns we have, and so forth. Now, with Bandura, he starts talking about the self system, a person's cognitive skills, abilities, and attitudes, and how that guides how we perceive and evaluate and control ourselves in different situations. And it's flexible because it depends on the tasks that we're doing and whatever we're doing, if something and the environment that we're in. And so he generates this idea of self-efficacy, and self-efficacy I put more in bold because that's, again, a very big psychology word. And it's the most critical element influencing this idea. And so make sure that I have seen on an FRQ self-efficacy quite a bit. So make sure that you know this word and understand what it means. It's a degree in which a person is convinced of their own capabilities and effectiveness in a situation. Okay. And there are certain things that determine efficacy judgments. What are the degree in which we are convinced we can actually do something. So at the top of the list is performance outcomes. So in past experiences, how well have we done in a certain situation? Sometimes we're really, our efficacy could be really high in certain situations because we've been really successful. And sometimes we've been like, oh, I was here before and I didn't do very well. And so that influences the ability to perform, okay, and the feeling and the degree at which we feel we can perform. The verbal persuasion is the encouragement or discouragement that we've gotten. What kind of feedback have we gotten to convince us of a certain level in which we can perform something? And then vicarious experiences, which is really neat, is where we get that observational learning from Bandura. So that is that we watch others and we live vicariously through the fact that they have performed, and we sort of develop our high or our low. So for instance, if you see somebody doing something really challenging and they get really frustrated and they don't like it, but they get through it, like you're going to have a lower efficacy based on how they performed and how they reacted to the situation. So you're going to be like, well, I don't know if I can do it. If somebody else can do it really well, then you have more of, you're convinced more of being able to do that. And then the last one is physiological feedback, which goes back to our sort of emotional arousal that we have talked about in the past. And we experience a sensation, and our body gives us this emotional arousal response. And because of the way that we feel about a situation, we will then develop a high or low efficacy based on how our body is responding. So it can acquire new behaviors and strengthen our beliefs. And definitely we would learn from observation, and then those mastery experiences are going to be more successful. So we'll try to master something, and it's something he believed was a lifelong process, this idea of self-efficacy and trying to grow. So again, it was more of a sort of going off of the humanistic, that we sort of have this long life process, but that a lot of it is based on the fact of our environment and sort of what we see and learn. Some of the strengths of social cognitive theory is it had empirical evidence. It's not clinical impressions. It was not just observations. It was actual data, and it was testable. And it did have an impact on the field and understanding personality in particular. Its weaknesses they felt it was not realistic with the complexity of factors that can affect behavior and thought. It didn't recognize any unconscious emotions and conflicts, and it was very limited in the area of personality because of situations and belief of self rather than the whole person. So all of them are pretty limited in so forth. So we kind of take all of the theories and kind of learn some stuff about personality based on all the theories. I think that's kind of the best thing to do. The most common contemporary one now to sort of focus on is based on the beginnings of the trait theory. And like the other theories, this really is talking about universal explanations for personality, and it really talks about the differences, the unique traits that we all have. And it focuses on identifying, describing, and measuring those differences and so forth. You can see that kind of personality wheel that's there between emotional and unemotional and introverted and extroverted. That was kind of how it all started, was just some basic traits and then expand it out to our big five. So a trait is a relative, stable, enduring predisposition to consistently behave in a certain way. And they decided to start describing it in a range from extreme to opposite of the extreme. And then most people, they said, would sort of lie in the middle. So an extreme on one side would be overbearing, and then the opposite of overbearing might be friendly. Rude, and then in the middle is sort of friendly. And most people lie in that friendly. So the two extremes, overbearing, rude, and then we have friendly in the middle. And that's where most people lie. We have surface traits and we have source traits that Cantel came up with trait theory. Surface traits are easily seen and inferred by observers. Gordon and Alport found that we had 4,000 surface traits, which Cantel is going to take down quite a bit to 16 eventually. And then source traits are more fundamental, they're more broad, they're basis and universal to most people, and they're more core to the personality. So I've got a kind of a little exercise that I want you to stop and do. And we're going to use a character from Grease, one of my favorite movies that I actually saw in the movie theater. And when I was 5. Yeah. And I want you to look at the scene where Danny Zuko is with his friends. And it shows you sort of the social situation that he's in. And I want you to see if you can determine his source traits and his surface traits. Surface traits are kind of easy. Source traits might be a little tougher to sort of look at. But go ahead and pause this video. Go out to Canvas and then click on the Danny Zuko video and then come back and I'll give you the answers. Okay, so here's the answer. Okay, so his surface traits are definitely extroversion and conscientiousness. His source traits, though, are he's definitely an attention seeker. He likes to be in control. He likes to impress others and cares about his appearance. So again, the surface is sort of like what we kind of see him do. He is outgoing and he is conscientious about what his friends feel, what Sandy thinks, and all that kind of stuff. And then all the internal things, the kind of the core things, is things that people wouldn't really know. So these are the things that people don't really can tell about somebody from just meeting them. And then when they get to know them, they see these source traits and they sort of see what's deep inside somebody. And so forth. So thought we'd do something a little fun there with Grease. So Cantel took the 4,000 original traits that were source traits and reduced them down to 171 and finally to 16. And that's how he developed the 16 personality factor questionnaire, the 16PF, which is one of those personality tests that you can take. And in this one, it uses the factor analysis to identify the traits that were closely related to each other and then develop those down. Now, Hans Isaac, he developed 3 dimensions, though, that were different from Cantel. Took the trait idea and said, okay, we're going to do surface traits and do 3 dimensions of them. So he had introversion and extroversion, neuroticism and emotional stability, and psychoticism. So with introversion and extroversion, they looked at a degree in which a person gets their energy. So introverts get their energy from more self-focus, while extroverts get their energy from being in groups. And then he looked at people's emotional stability and divided into 4 different types. You can be an introvert and neurotic, an introvert and stable, an extrovert and neurotic, and an extrovert and stable. And then with psychoticism, it's that last one of somebody who's antisocial, cold, hostile, versus warm and caring. So he had these dimensions, and that's sort of where trait theory was going, is sort of where we lie in these certain categories. And then Heinz Onzik believed that that personality is due to biological factors, which I think is really interesting because he looked at introverts and said besides in comparison to extroverts, that they're introverts, their nervous system is a lot more sensitive. So that sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system that we were talking about, that they are more sensitive. So they get their energy from more self-focus instead of being with a bunch of people. With extroverts, they have less sensitive nervous system, so they seek out being aroused. There was a study done by Campbell and Holly that found that extrovert students tend to rely and want to study in more noisy, open college libraries, while introverts study in more quiet areas. So again, that sort of drive, that arousal theory that we talked about with motivation can also be connected to biological and also with personality. So with personality theory, the idea is that you're an introvert, and so those behaviors come out, which can also be why you're motivated to do certain things as well. So interesting study. Eventually then we get to the most contemporary view, which is a sort of an evolution of the trait theory, which is the 5-factor model. And this is that personality can be based on 5 different traits. So they kind of took Hans Isaac's, sort of spectrum there and sort of added some things and added, a structure to that. So they basically think that it represents the structural organization of personal traits, and that we have a range between 2 extremes, with most people falling in the middle as before. And this is universal. It's done across cultural in different places. In most cultures, they really kind of focus on these 5 factors. And it's based on human species, universally and biologically based. And McCrae and Costa created the most common surface traits that were associated. So neuroticism, and extroversion, openness to experience, agreeability, and conscientiousness. And so you can see some of the old ones like neuroticism and extroversion were in the old theories, and then they sort of expanded. And again, these are all cross-cultural as well. So when we look at this, if you want to try to remember the robust 5, then remember the acronym or mnemonic OCEAN. Okay, OCEAN. You don't have to put them in order. So it's going to be openness, conscientiousness, E for extroversion, agreeability, and emotional stability is that E, or neuroticism, right? So when we look at the chart for OCEAN, we look at example behaviors for low scorers and high scorers. For instance, for openness, people who score low prefer not to be exposed to alternative moral systems. They're very closed in. They're narrow interest and not analytical, down to earth. High openness, people enjoy new types of haircuts, body piercings, imagination, and they're really untraditional. Conscientiousness, a low score prefers a spur of the moment action to plan, unreliable, hedonistic, love of their self. Carelessness versus conscientious that are high scores, never late to a date, organized, hardworking, neat, persevere, punctual, and self-disciplined. Extroverts, low, prefer quiet, and then a life of the party on the opposite side. Agreeableness, low, they're quick to assert their own rights. They're sometimes rude, uncooperative, versus somebody who's got a high score, agrees with others about political opinions, good-natured, forgiving, helpful. And then neurotic, or the emotional stable part, not getting irritable by small annoyances, a low score, calm, unemotional, secure, self-satisfied, versus worried about the little things, hypochondriac, feeling inadequate, things like that. So you can see a lot of personality traits as you take these categories and kind of use those and whether or not somebody would have that. So these are super traits that are on a continuum, and they have all these other related traits, as you can see in the boxes, related traits with them. So conscientiousness, for instance, being responsible, independent, and then the other side being impulsive and carelessness. So those are the related traits to the super trait, if that makes sense. So that's why they call it the robust 5. Now, is it universal? Some researchers say it does not apply to pre-industrial indigenous tribes in developing countries, that, some of these traits wouldn't apply to certain cultures. And then how is it universal? David Buss said we could look at we should look at the utility of the factor from an evolutionary perspective, that all of these traits have something to do with evolution, and that they reflect some of that social landscape of humans adapting over time. So for extroversion, the social power, like So, social power, but also wanting to have connectiveness with human beings. Agreeableness is sharing resources, and conscientiousness is for survival, being trustworthy and survival. So some of these can really be seen as universal because they are evolutionary as well. So the conclusion is traits are stable over time, definitely from child to adulthood. They're pretty stable. They can change, though, a certain degree is what they would say. These longitudinal data shows that trends that coincide with developmental maturity. So that meaning, as somebody matures, then a degree of their personality would change. But if we really deep down look at ourselves, you may have been shy as a child with other strangers, but really an extrovert in your own family. And so as you mature and get a little bit better at dealing with other people and less shy, then you become more of an extrovert instead of shy and an introvert, but like you basically started as that same thing. Some people could argue that you do change. You're not the same person when you were a child and so forth. But what they've found is that data, it's really, as we mature, we have a decline of emotional instability. A lot of times that can be biological, amygdala getting smaller, less irritated, hormones, things like that. We increase our agreeableness, and our conscientiousness. As we get older, we get out of that egocentrism where we're thinking about ourselves, and we really understand that we have to be agreeable and conscientious of other people's feelings. We have a stability. There's a stability in extroversion, and openness to experience usually kind of expands to early and late adult. In addition, it's consistent across different situations that we have these traits. And then situational influences can affect expression of our personality. So there is a complex interaction between traits and situations, and we've talked about that we're sometimes limited by social rules and what's appropriate in certain situations, and we learn that. So that social cognitive sort of drizzles into trait theory as well and has its place today. Most personality is reflected when we are informal and we're in a private situation where we don't have social rules kind of guiding us, and that's when we can really see our personality come out. And it's associated with specific brain structures and so forth. So now what you're going to do is you're going to pause the video and you are going to open up the blank brain that I have on Canvas, print it out, and you are going to come back and we're going to fill it in and color in the parts of the brain that are related to personality. Okay, now that you're ready to do that, let's take a look first of all what personality in general that they were talking about before we color some stuff in. So they believed that extroverts have lit up areas of with positive images, and then they can see that people that are more neurotic have areas of the brain light up when they see negative images. So your personality can influence sort of like how your brain is processing and what it processes more than other things. Carl DeYoung did a study with 100 females and males and gave them MRIs, and then they took the Neo personality inventory to decide what kind of measurement of their big five that they had. So it was a correlational study. And so one of the things they found was that extroverts, this is where you'll color in, have larger volume tissue in their medial orbitofrontal cortex. So that's the very top picture that you see. The very front part here is your orbital frontal cortex, and that area is very sensitive to reward stimuli. So extroverts get that energy from outside, sort of stimuli and so forth. So that makes sense that that part of their brain was lighting up on the MRI. The second was agreeableness. People that were more agreeable increased volume in their posterior cingulate cortex, and that is the kind of teal color that you see there. So you can kind of color that, so sort of like in that, just above the limbic system there that you can see. And that is the area understanding the beliefs of others. That makes a lot of sense because it's in your parietal lobe, so that perception. And it's close to the to the frontal lobe, but not quite. And it's part of the cerebral cortex, which makes sense that it's sort of processing information. Conscientiousness lied in the frontal cortex, middle frontal gyrus. And that is right in that center part, an area of planning, working, memory, and self-regulation, your conscientiousness, okay? Less perception and more of like sort of that working self-regulation area is in that front there. So make sure you've colored all three parts of that and put down what personality trait goes with each one. As we continue, we can look at high neuroticism. Has a reduced volume in the hippocampus. So remember, that's part of the limbic system. You'll see that red area there that has to do with memory. It's also the area related to stress and depression as well. And then higher volume in the mid-cingulate cortex. If you see that yellow part of the brain that kind of goes right above the limbic system, it's in the cerebral cortex though. The mid is sort of the middle section, okay? So you could draw and color the whole mid or the cingulate cortex or gyrus, but then you just want to have the middle section of that, okay? And that's going to be a higher volume there of people with neuroticism. So neuroticism is related to different structures of the brain, which is why they would say that not all personalities are related, that they, have, different parts of the brain that they sort of can light up. So DeYoung said no significant pattern with openness and experience in the brain. There's no biological evidence showing any relationship with personality, although they're really not sure sort of the causation of why all these things are happening. But those are the parts of the brain that you should have colored on your brain, and you can put that away. So let's talk about genetics and twins and all that briefly, and then I have a video for you to watch on a couple of twins, and it's just amazing to see those that were separated at birth. So is personality genetic? What do you think? That's something that we would discuss at class. How does the research apply to your family? I want you to think about how, personality-wise, how connected you are to people in your own home, and how similar you are to their personality. So Cantel and Isaac said that it was partial genetics in origin, that are genetic or learned the trait through modeling from a parent. So they obviously would think about, whether or not you learned some of those traits from your parents or it was somewhat genetic. Behavior genetics did studies on the effects of genes and heredity on behavior. They looked and measured similarities and differences in large family groups, and they looked at the degree in which people were actually related. And the higher the degree that you were related to somebody, the more traits that were more similar, which kind of makes sense, especially with twins when you have, identical twins. So there were studies, again, done on twins and fraternal twins that were reared together and also reared apart, and studies also done on adopted children. And they said that certain traits are influenced by genetics, like extroversion and neuroticism and so forth. Makes a lot of sense. Twin studies, openness to experience, conscientiousness, and agreeableness were influenced by genetics, but they were lesser. And really, the constant thing that we've heard, environment is equal to genetics on personality, just like it is for everything else, okay? Look at twin studies. Twin studies obviously are great things to look for intelligence and also parenting and attachment and personality. So twin studies are great because it's like same genes, same DNA almost, and different environments and what happens. So the Minnesota study that was done of twins that were reared apart or raised apart in 1980, it was a study of 100 pairs of identical and fraternal twins separated at birth and then raised in different homes. And the results that they found was identical twins had similar personalities, occupations, hobbies, habits, and this is where you get the gym twins. The video I have for you too is about 5 minutes long, and it shows you some other twins as well. It has some really cool stories that you can see. But these gentlemen, these gym twins, were separated 40 years, but had similar heights, posture, voice, speech patterns, married and divorced. The same woman, her name was Linda. That's very consistent. That happens a lot. Remarried women named Betty. Sons were named James Allen and James Allen, almost identical. They both bit their nails, chain smoked, worked in basement jobs, and vacationed in the same model cars. A lot of them will, wear the same clothes, pick the same hobbies to do, coaching, things like that, which is really kind of weird. There were numerous quirky simulations, but not in fraternal twins. Genetically identical twins shared the same configuration of interacting genes. That's where they say that's how they influence their personality. They almost, identically have the same DNA. And those emergence traits, those that appear only out of a unique configuration of many interacting genes, but they don't run in the family, that's sort of where they think that, some of these traits can carry over. So emergent traits are unique and so forth. And what the example they gave you in your book is the two parents that have a normal IQ and then they have a genius kid. How does that happen? And that's because of a unique configuration of genes in the child that then creates a higher IQ. And that's where they think genetically there can be some differences in genes as well. So there's still many differences with twins. Genes play only a partial role in personality, but there's some really cool stories out there about twin studies and so forth. Criticisms of the trait theory is it failure to explain human personality, but it just kind of puts labels on predispositions. There's no attempt to explain how and why individuals develop in different ways and so forth. Even though we were just talking about genetics, like it's using the trait theory, that's not part of the trait theory. It's just showing the genetical part of it. And then failure to address motives and the role of the unconscious again. And the beliefs about self-influence and growth and stuff. So it doesn't, have any of the other theories kind of in it, and people are not sure how useful it is. Now, starting next class, we're going to be actually taking and going over the personality test, but let's just go over the goals and the two types, and then next class period, we're going to be actually doing those tests and going over what they are. So the test that actually people give for personality is the two goals are it accurately and consistently reflects a person's characteristics on some dimension, and then it also will predict like how that person's going to think and act in the future. And there are two types of tests that will be looking at: projective tests and self-reporting inventories. Okay, so next virtual class, you guys will be actually taking some of those tests, looking at them, looking at the characteristics of them, and then studying for the test. Okay, all right, to end today, let's go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and do your defense mechanism review. If you're in a situation where you need the answers for the last review that we did, depending on which class you're in, then you'll see those at the bottom and underneath the handout 11.4. So if you need to go back over because we were in an e-learning situation, then go ahead and look at those answers from the last review we did. Otherwise, just open up that handout. You can write it on a sheet of paper and then come on back and I'll show you the answers. Okay, let's take a look at the answers for 11.4. Number 1 is reaction formation. Number 2, sublimation. Number 3, rationalization. Number 4, denial. Number 5, projection. Number 6, regression. Number 7 is no defense mechanism. He's just angry that Carmen lied. That's it. Displacement is 8. 9 is undoing. 10, repression. So hopefully you guys did good on that. If you have any questions on those, make sure you message me with that. Okay, and then the last thing for today that you need to do is you need to share out and do the discussion board on Freud. So was Freud a genius or was he neurotic? And you're going to post one post to it, and then you're going to respond to one other person at least in that discussion on Freud. And that's going to be based on the argument project that you have already done. So make sure that is submitted to Canvas and that you submit your discussion on the discussion board. All right, guys, have a great day.